All right. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning, everyone. I hope that everybody is great. Hope everybody's having a great and wonderful morning. And for those of you who are all around the world in your different time zones, it may be afternoon for you, it may be evening for you. So I want to say hello to you as well. Here in the States, it's still morning, 11 a.m. In the States on the East Coast, on the West Coast, it's about 8 a.m. So I want to say good morning to each of you. I hope everybody is doing well. Today is Thinking Thursday, Theology Thursday, and I am very thankful to be alive, very excited. This is Daring Dialogues. For those of you who are with us for the first time, I am your host, Shantae Charles. We are with most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, unless we have a conflict in schedule, and which then I will usually come on and do an evening edition at 7 p.m. So if there's a time where you don't see me in the morning, you can always check my channel that evening around 7 p.m. and I'm usually doing an evening edition. All right. So, couple of books that we're going to be getting into as we are now into the second half of season 4, which is hopefully going to end. We've got 50 episodes left of this season. So I'm calculating that we're probably going to end somewhere in the middle of December. All right. Because I do want to finish season 4 before the year is out. Also, I was so excited yesterday that I forgot to do my giveaway for episode 50. So, my giveaway this time is the first, excuse me, the first 3 people who can write me, email me at reachon@gmail.com. The first 3 people who can write me what was the most impactful show of season 4 for you thus far, because we've done 50 episodes. So, what was the most impactful show for you this season? All right. So, that's the key. It has to be season 4. And the first 3 people that I hear from, please tell me what was impactful about the show, and give me some details so I know that you actually watched the show. Tell me your most impactful show for this season, the first 3 people, and I will be sending you a personal pack from me of some of my favorite things. It's also going to include a gift card, but it's going to be basically a care package from me. All right. So if you want to participate in that, again, it's the first 3 people that can write me and tell me what was the most impactful show for you for this season. My email address is, all right, do not email my ministry email, all right? Email me personally at reachshantae, SHANTAE, at gmail.com. And I will take the first 3 responses. And once I read your responses, then I'll give you further direction as to how you can receive your Daring Dialogues care package from me. All right. All right. Next month, We Dare Squad can look for their next package from me. I'm working on something right now, and hopefully it will be done so that I can send it out in your care package for November. All right. So We are looking at how Africa shaped the Christian mind and the cross and the lynching tree. And we're going to start with, let's start with the cross and the lynching tree today. We will start there. James H. Cone has been really delving into the message of the cross and its relation to the lynching tree, is relation to the suffering of Black Americans in this country. It's a very interesting theological treatise on his life. He talks about his life. He talks about the civil rights movement, and now he is talking about Reinhold Niebuhr and his Christian theology, and how his Christian theology kind of missed an opportunity to really teach people and help African Americans and even white Americans really identify the cross with what was happening during his time. He writes about how lynching, because it was so prevalent during Niebuhr's time, that lynching would have been a good thing to really convey to people the message of the suffering of Black America and tie that into the message of the cross. Unfortunately, Reinhold Niebuhr didn't do that, and he pretty much stayed away from what we might say today is a controversial topic. And as he said, Niebuhr, in his own words, said that he was a bit of a coward, and he found it difficult to run counter to the general opinion. And that's kind of what we're seeing today. We're seeing lots of white ministers and pastors and leaders who could really speak to our day and age, and who could really encourage white America spiritually to really take on this plight for Black America. Good morning, love. Who could really speak to our times and our culture and say, these things are unjust, these things must stop. But they're not doing that. They're actually, I would say in many ways, like Reinhold Niebuhr, missing their opportunity within their generation to speak to something that is on the heart of this generation, which is injustice, police brutality, the whole immigration crisis. Like, who's going to look back in history and see the pastors and the leaders who stood up morally when they needed to stand up? And who's going to be reading us 50 years from now, or looking at our videos 50 years from now, to say, did this person really stand up when they could have? Did this person really address injustice when they had the opportunity to do so? So many of us right now are writing our own histories, and somebody's going to look back on us at some point and say, did they really stand for justice and truth and mercy and righteousness and equality for all? They'll be making some of the same comments about us. So let's continue, and this is actually going to close out this chapter, and then we're going to start Martin Luther King Jr.'s struggle to redeem the soul of America, which is chapter 3, bearing the cross and staring down the lynching tree. Niebuhr was by no means alone in his failure to express prophetic rage against racial injustice and his silence on lynching. In 1935, John Bennett wrote a book on social salvation and did not even mention the need to be saved from racial injustice, especially lynching, which was resurgent during his decade. Bennett and I talked about his blindness, and he responded with The Radical Imperative from Theology to Social Ethics, which was published in 1975. Good morning. Addressing social issues he omitted to mention in his earlier texts, especially race. Before Niebuhr and Bennett, Walter Rauschenbusch, the social gospel movement's greatest theologian, expressed his frustration. For years, the problem of the two races seemed to me so tragic, so insoluble, that I have never yet ventured to discuss it in public. The social gospel advocates held conferences on the status of the Negro in Mohonk, New York in 1890 and 1891 and felt no need to invite any blacks because, as Lyman Abbott said, a patient is not invited to the consultation of the doctors on his case. Wow. So, how are you going to hold a conference on the status of the Negro and not invite any black people to the conference? In contrast to Niebuhr and many social gospel theologians, there were few white preachers who did oppose lynching and who noted the connection between the lynching of African Americans and the crucifixion of Jesus. Among these was Episcopalian Quincy Ewing, who served parishes in Louisiana and Mississippi, participated in the founding of the NAACP, and was widely praised by black leaders. He preached and wrote against the lyncher as a murderer in the eyes of Almighty God. Andrew Sled, a professor of Latin at Emory College, ended his silence in it with an essay, The Negro, Another View, after seeing the lynching of Sam Hose. Like nearly all whites who opposed lynching, he did not deny whites were a superior race, but that alone did not justify lynching blacks. His dissent cost him his job at Emory, which was later restored. E.T. Welford wrote a book entitled The Lynching of Jesus in 1905. Lynching law is usually credited as an American product, he wrote. The most awful application of it, however, belongs to the first century. In a sermon in 1903, Atlanta minister John E. White of Second Baptist Church asked a penetrating question that did not develop it. Will it be considered one-sided if I suggest that Christ was lynched by a legalized mob and coming out of that stupendous event was a divine force and truth which will cure the lynching evil and settle all problems of evil in the world? Niebuhr was a Christian theologian of the cross who knew all about Jesus' solidarity with the poor and the consequences he suffered for that from the Roman Empire. If the American Empire has any similarities with that of Rome, and we can see it does, one really understand the theological meaning of Jesus on a Roman cross without seeing him first through the image of blacks on the lynching tree? Can American Christians see the reality of Jesus' cross without seeing it as the lynching tree? How could Niebuhr make the tragedy of the cross the central theme in his theology while ignoring the obvious tragedies of slavery, segregation, and lynching in the United States? Even confronting the death of 4 children in a Birmingham church in a dialogue with James Baldwin about the event, Niebuhr did not summon the language and passion to speak adequately to it. What is missing in his language about Calvary was the racial context that defined the actual cross bearers in American society. Unless we look at the facts of experience as Niebuhr's own realism demanded, what we say about the cross remains at the level of theological abstraction, like Karl Barth's Word of God separated from the real crosses in our midst. One who made the connection real was Billie Holiday with Strange Fruit, her signature song about Southern lynching, when she sang that song in the words of Elijah Wood, "You feel as if you're at the foot of the tree." Upon hearing another singer, Josh White, sing Strange Fruit in Chicago, Bridget McCullough, a German woman who grew up in the war-torn Hamburg, Germany, did with her imagination what Niebuhr did not do, even though he identified with the Jews there. On those southern trees, along with black men, hung the murdered Jews, she said, hung all the victims of violence, and one survived to tell the story, to tear our hearts apart, to make us feel and remember. Niebuhr's heart and those of most white religious leaders, unfortunately, remained unmoved. Just as Martin Luther King Jr. learned much from Reinhold Niebuhr, Niebuhr could have deepened his understanding of the cross by being a student of King and the Black freedom movement he led. King could have opened Niebuhr's eyes to see the lynching tree as Jesus' cross in America. White theologians do not normally turn to the Black experience to learn about theology. But if the lynching tree is America's cross, and if the cross is the heart of the Christian gospel, perhaps Martin Luther King Jr., who endeavored to take up his own cross and follow Christ, as did no other theologian in American history, has something to teach America about Jesus's cross. Chapter 3, Bearing the Cross and Staring Down the Lynching Tree. Martin Luther King Jr. struggled to redeem the soul of America. Now, if you're interested in hearing King's writings read aloud by myself in our discussion, there are some hashtags that you can go to on Facebook, and you can follow these hashtags. Do, 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 do. All right. Hashtag the Radical King, hashtag why we can't wait. If you type in either one of those hashtags to your Facebook search bar, it will bring up all of my videos for reading Martin Luther King's work. And I think there's one more hashtag, but I can't remember. Oh, I think it's, I think I remember it. I think it's that. Also, hashtag chaos or community. If you look up any of these hashtags, it will take you to the books of MLK that I have read in their entirety by video and held discussion on. And so they are still on Facebook. It got to the point on Facebook where where my reading MLK was so controversial that Facebook actually wound up banning me from Facebook Live videos for almost a year and a half after I did these readings. But they are still available on Facebook. So if you are interested in hearing MLK's work read aloud specifically and dissected, you can go to any of these hashtags, all right? And I think I read 3 different books from MLK, and the videos are still up on Facebook Live, all right? So I happen to like MLK, and I like his writings and his teachings, because one thing that I realized that as I started reading MLK, I realized that a lot of what he said and what he taught was not applied to the next generations. It was not followed through. And so let's take a look at one of the key things that MLK was always talking about. If you go and read his writings, he was talking about this idea of redeeming the soul of America. He was talking about the judgment coming to America if they don't do right by black people. He was talking about imminent destruction of a nation who refuses to deal with the civil rights of black people. That was a part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings and writings and philosophy. Even though he went about it in a non-violent way, he still gave several warnings to America, several prophetic warnings about the fabric of our country being torn apart and destroyed by this one issue that America refuses and continues to refuse to address. 2 of his quotes say this. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I will die standing up for the freedom of my people." I think he fulfilled that. He said, "If a man hasn't discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live." Only a year after 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. began to preach at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Louis Bo Till in Mississippi shook the black community in the South and the nation. In a sermon at Dexter, King called the Till lynching, quote, "one of the most brutal and inhumane crimes in the 20th century." Now, if you have not been to the Smithsonian Museum yet, they do have a room in the museum here in DC, the African American, the new museum. They have a room dedicated to Emmett Till. And the last time we went, we didn't go on the last tour we didn't go because literally the line was kind of like wrapped around the building and down the stairs to get into this one room. But the previous time before, we did get a chance to go in. And when you go in, it's only his coffin in there. because they, I think at one point they had to exhume him and do forensics, and then they reburied him. But the original coffin that he was buried in is in the museum. And they have the music playing from his actual funeral, and then the whole wall has one of the scenes from the funeral. When you go in that room, there is a palpable grief that you can feel in that room. Now, some people have snuck in there and they've basically not followed the directions of the museum, which is when you go in there, they just want you to take in what's in the room. They don't want you to take any pictures. Some people, of course, have still snuck in there and took pictures anyway, with total disregard to the occasion. But if you follow directions and you go in, you can actually feel the grief in that room. It's not explainable. But you go, if you get an opportunity to go, I would encourage you to probably go see that first before you go try to look at the other parts of the museum, because the line gets so long to get in there. But I would agree with Martin Luther King that it was one of the most brutal and inhumane crimes in the 20th century. Although the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education 1954 decision had outlawed segregation in public schools, the Till lynching was a shocking reminder of the enduring power of white supremacy. It's still enduring because the person who actually got Emmett Till murdered in the first place, 83 years old, still free, just wrote a book about what happened and admitted that he didn't do it. I want you to think about that. She admitted that he didn't do it, that she lied. And she's still walking around free. Just let that sink in. Nobody has gone to get her. Nobody has said, ma'am, we need to bring you in for questioning. None of that. This lady who caused this boy to be brutally murdered over a lie that she now admits was a lie is still free. So when people say things like they don't understand white privilege and they don't understand white supremacy and they don't understand the powers that be that still are operating in our country, just understand that the person who was the cause of Emmett Till's murder has admitted that it was all a lie. And she's still walking around scot-free, living her life with a book deal. She got paid to write a book about this young boy's murder in her life, where she admitted he didn't do anything to her. And she's still free. She not walking to anybody's court. She not in handcuffs. She has not been apprehended. She not even considered someone to go and pick up. That is the America that we live in. And if we think that God is winking at that, God is not winking. So just in case you didn't know why we need to be repenting daily and asking for the mercy of God, that's just one reason why. Unanswered innocent blood. Not just the babies in wombs, by the way. Because he had whistled at a white woman allegedly and reportedly said, "Bye, baby," as he departed from a store on August 24th, 1955, Emmett Till was picked up 4 days later around 2 a.m., beaten beyond recognition, shot in the head, and thrown in the Tallahatchie River, weighted down with a heavy gin fan. To a remarkable extent, the Till lynching would provide the spark that lit the fire of resistance in the Negro masses, inspiring, as King said, to rock the nation and to demand their freedom now. This was the beginning of the civil rights movement in Mississippi in the 20th century, said grassroots leader Amzie Moore. It galvanized the country, recalled John Lewis, the Georgia congressman and veteran civil rights activist. A lot of us young black students in the South weren't sitting in just for ourselves. We were sitting in for Emmett Till. We went on freedom rides for Emmett Till. Cleveland Sellers, another young activist in the civil rights movement, remembered, "The atrocity that struck me the most was Emmett Till's lynching. There was something about the cold-blooded callousness of Emmett Till's lynching that touched everyone in our community. Black people throughout the country were outraged that white racists would stoop so low as to lynch an innocent child." Roy Wilkins, the executive head of the NAACP, spoke for many. It would appear from this lynching that the state of Mississippi has decided to maintain white supremacy by murdering children. If anything was remarkable about the Till lynching, it was not so much the callousness of the deed as the militant response it evoked. If lynching was intended to instill silence and passivity, this event had the opposite effect, inspiring blacks to rise in defiance, to cast off centuries of paralyzing fear. The signal of this change was marked by the actions of Mamie Till Bradley, Emmett's mother, who refused to allow this heinous act, like so many similar cases, to remain in the shadows or to fade from public memory. When Emmett's body was brought back to Chicago, she insisted that the sealed casket be opened for a 3-day viewing, exposing his battered and bloated corpse, so that everybody can see what they did to my boy. She exposed white brutality and black faith to the world and significantly expressed a parallel meaning between her son's lynching and the crucifixion of Jesus. "Lord, you gave your son to remedy a condition," she cried out, "but who knows but what the death of my only son might bring to end lynching." It was as if she was pleading with God to let her son's death count for something, to help save other black boys from Emmett's fate. "Darling, you have not died in vain," she said to Emmett as she looked at that horribly mangled monstrosity. Your life has been sacrificed for something." 600,000 people viewed his bruised body and attended the funeral, and many millions more saw Jet magazine photos that traveled around the world. "This is not for Emmett," Miss Bradley said, "because my boy can't be helped now, but to make it safe for other boys. Unless an example is made of the lynchers of Emmett, it won't be safe for a Negro to walk the streets anywhere in America. Hashtag, where is the lie? Hashtag Michael Brown. Hashtag Tamir Rice. Hashtag 9-year-old boy who just a couple of days ago got accused of touching a white woman's butt. And first thing she thought to do was call the police. And still, other reasons for America needing to repent. John Lewis, who was 15 at the time, reacted like many black teenagers. "I was shaken to my core," he recalled in his memoir. "He could have been me. That could have been me, beaten, tortured, dead at the bottom of a river. The Till lynching shook me up too. I was 17, beginning my second year at Shorter College in North Little Rock, Arkansas, where I was the daily news reporter to the Student Assembly, focusing on local, state, national, and world events. I read stories to the college community about the atrocity, the trial, and acquittal of the accused men. Like Lewis, I remember saying to myself, Emmett Till could have been me. My older brothers felt the same way, as did most young males we knew. While African Americans had heard about many previous lynchings, the murder of Emmett Till was an unforgettable event, a horror etched in black memory forever. He was so young, only 14, just a child from Chicago, not really aware of the etiquette of Jim Crow culture in Mississippi. and what it could mean if he failed to observe the ways of white people. Although blacks followed the trial closely, they knew that the two white men directly responsible for the shameful act, J.W. Millen and Roy Bryant, would never see a day in jail, even though they admitted in court to the federal crime of kidnapping. They were acquitted by an all white jury after an hour of deliberation. So, all white jury got an answer for that. J.W. Millen and Roy Bryant are answering in eternity for that. And the lady who's still alive, who caused all of this to go down in the first place, all have to answer for that. Crimes against blacks seldom led to conviction. Instead, the perpetrators were often rewarded for putting N words in their place. And when white men were convicted, which was rare, the punishment was usually a slap on the wrist. One Mississippi court awarded the family of a lynched victim just $1 for their loss. $1. You lynched someone's child and you basically told them their child was worth $1. What we got to repent for? The list is getting long, people. For Mamie Till Bradley, the lynching of her only son was indeed a very heavy cross to bear, as it was for other parents who lost their sons and daughters to Judge Lynch. Black Christians saw in her response to her son's lynching a reflection of the spiritual struggles of Job. On the one hand, Miss Bradley's prayers reflected the obedient and patient spirit of the biblical Job. Lord, take my soul, show me what you want me to do, and make me able to do it. Yet on the other hand, there was the rebellious spirit of the angry Job, who, feeling wronged by God, cried out in the anguish of my spirit and the bitterness of my soul, why have you made me your target? Miss Bradley also railed at God. Why did you do this? Why are you so cruel that you would let this happen? Why do you allow this kind of persecution? Such questions are often found on the lips of parents who lose a child to a much too early death. But with a loss involving violence or lynching, so unjust and so unnecessary, the agony was even deeper, extending down the corridors of history for blacks who dared not forget that white supremacy meant for what white supremacy meant for their children. Hashtag Jordan Davis, who was shot at a gas station because a white man in Jacksonville said his music was too loud. Miss Bradley, however, was not left alone in her agony. She spoke about a strange experience, a voice that said to her, Mamie, it was ordained from the beginning of time that Emmett Lewis Till would die. You should be grateful to be the mother of a boy who died blameless like this. Bo Till will never be forgotten. There is a job for you to do now. Suffering always poses the deepest test of faith, radically challenging its authenticity and meaning. No rational explanation can soothe the pain of an aching heart and troubled mind. In the face of the lynching death of an innocent child, Black Christians could only reach into the depths of their imagination for a transcendent meaning that could take them through despair to hope and beyond tragedy. For Miss Bradley, the voice she heard was the voice of the resurrected Jesus. It spoke of hope, that although white racists could take her son's life, they could not deprive his life and death of an ultimate meaning. She had heard Christ speak to her about her purpose. As in the resurrection of the crucified one, God could transmute death into triumph, ugliness into beauty, despair into hope, the cross into the resurrection. And so, like Paul, Miss Bradley was afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not unto despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. We do not know what really happened in Miss Bradley's revelatory experience. Its meaning remains locked in mystery. What we do know is that her spirit of resistance caught fire in black communities throughout the nation, justifying the claim of author Clenora Weems that Emmett Till was, quote, the sacrificial lamb of the civil rights movement. Hashtag Botham Shem Jean. Only 3 months after the Till lynching, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a city bus in Montgomery, for she too had said in her own statements that she refused to give up her seat, and one of the main things that made her do that was that she was thinking about Emmett Till. In her refusal, a new Negro was born. Rather than ride segregated buses in humiliation, blacks decided to walk the streets with pride until the walls of segregation, like the Jericho walls, came tumbling down. What was it that cast our black people's fear of death and sent them flowing into the streets, defying mob violence? Many reasons, certainly, not all of them stemming from Christian faith. Secular activists like Robert Moses, James Foreman, and Stokely Carmichael drew inspiration from other sources, like Albert Camus's The Rebel and Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. With Camus, they said, better to die on one's feet than to live on one's knees. But for poor Southern blacks who had little formal education in philosophy or political philosophy, it was religion and their faith that offered the only resource and the language to fight against segregation and lynching. Martin Luther King Jr. came to embody this faith, courage, and intelligence. His faith was derived from the black church. His courage originated from his faith, and his intelligence came from his intellectual discipline, deepened and expanded by his time at Morehouse College, Crozer Seminary, and Boston University. What he learned in college and graduate school helped him to reflect critically on faith and to develop from it a method of social change that would transform race relations in the United States and abroad. When he accepted the invitation to become the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, King knew that he was risking his life. Other blacks knew it too. As he often put it, freedom is not free. So we will continue chapter 3, learning about MLK's mission to redeem the soul of white America, which, as we could see, by the way, has not yet been redeemed. Now, argue with that. If you think the soul of white America has been redeemed, email me and tell me why you think so. How about we still working on it? I'm not talking about individual white people. I'm talking about the soul of white America. I say we're still working on it. All right. We are in Thomas E. Uden's book, How Africa Has Shaped the Christian Mind, Rediscovering the African Seedbed of Western Christianity. And we are on chapter 5, Temptations. I want to thank those of you who are still with me as we hold court looking at these intense subject matters. I know sometimes it can get intense, but I must do it. All right. Temptations. European historical scholarship gave us form criticism, which intends to show how oral traditions shape the history of the transmission of written text. It has been applied with intense imagination in the narratives of the transition of the faith from Asia to Europe. But that same form criticism was used to dismiss almost entirely the viability of any oral traditions coming out of Africa. This is why the political uses and prejudices of form criticism need to now be carefully analyzed. The Markan and Ethiopic oral traditions have been almost totally ignored by historians. But the same historians do not require texts when they apply this criteria to the study of the New Testament. There, they are intensely interested in oral tradition. In Africa, suddenly the rules of the game change and oral tradition is ruled out. So, if some of the earliest history for African Christianity is mainly oral, why would you all of a sudden rule out their oral history, just skip right over it, and ignore it and not talk about it? Better yet, why wouldn't you begin to take the oral history of the early African Christians and commit it to writing for future generations? I have questions. The irony is that while digging into every conceivable speculative aspect of oral tradition for the Greco Roman world, European formal critical scholarship has become systematically blinded to the oral traditions of Africa. So if somebody tells you an oral tradition that was Roman in origin, you will go and search that out and you'll go listen to it and you'll report on it. But someone tells you the oral traditions of Africa, you don't think those matter. This is not good. The hermeneutics of suspicion have not yet been applied to the hermeneutics themselves. The embarrassing fact is that some of these deep African oral memories, still lacking text, are benefiting from the discovery of valid archaeological, textual, and paleogenical correlates. These traditions are not simply Hellenistic. They are Coptic, a distinctly different language and culture. They are Orthodox, ecumenical, and consensual Christianity taking root on the African soil into the full reaches of the upper and middle Nile. Similar communities took root in the valleys and sands of Libya, in the mountains of the Maghreb, of Numidia, and the great stretches of Mauritania, all the way to Tangiers. The spread of Christianity straight across North Africa appears to have been very rapid. From the start of the 3rd century, Tertullian was aware that Christians were being persecuted in Mauritania. The bishops of Mauritania took active part in general African councils at Carthage. Bishop Quintus is explicitly called a Mauritanian. By the 3rd century, Caesarea Mauritania had a Christian community whose cemetery goes back all the way to the persecution of Septimius Severus. Tapasa on the coast of western Algeria has a necropolis evidence and 3rd century votive inscriptions showing that there was a Christian presence there in pre-Constantinian times. The African oral traditions of the Upper Nile Valley, with the exception of the heterodox Gnostic texts, have not been seriously investigated in either Europe or the Americas. The door is open to African scholarship to re-examine these challenges. These studies must not proceed in a chauvinistic, Afrocentric way, but on the basis of the best evidence of historical and paleographic inquiry. The time is over for fawning subservience to European historical skepticism that is unwilling to grant validity to the corroborating evidence of early Christian African oral tradition while giving them great weight in early Christian Europe. If the flow of intellectual history in early Christianity was from south to north, then many questions of Western history will need to be re-examined. The early African texts and exegetical traditions, with their philosophical, catechetical, and liturgical wisdom, entered into the standard assumptions of medieval European teaching. If Africans forget that these ideas were first refined and developed out of Africa, they put themselves at an unnecessary disadvantage. It is incorrect to portray Africa to the world as if Africa has always been a bit lacking in intellectual toughness and slow to awaken to Western achievement. The irony is that these Western achievements themselves have their debt to Africa before they ever became accepted in Europe. A cruel trick has been played in tilted reporting of Africa's contributions to world history, ancient Christian texts and exegesis, have been entirely left out of it. So what can you but get but a skewed gospel if you take out the African people who formulated it? And we're wondering why Western Christianity has hit a brick wall. And we're wondering why people are looking at Western Christianity like, what is this stuff? And we wonder why people like Frank Viola can write a entire book that we're going to get into called Pagan Christianity. Because Africa's contributions and Christian texts and oral traditions that founded Christianity were left out entirely. That's like you walking around and your parents show up in the room, or your parents come to your graduation and you walk right past your parents and act like you don't see them. That's what has happened to the faith. You built up all of this stuff based on how you see Christ, right? You literally hijacked and stolen his identity. You've repainted him as Kenny Loggins. You've represented him all over the world. But your parentage and your footprints are all over Africa. And you don't want to acknowledge that. And you pass by it. And you say, oh, we don't need that part. We don't need those theologians. We don't need those early historians. We don't need those early church fathers. We're just going to ignore them. And we're going to start the faith right here where we jumped in. We're going to start here and move forward. You know, kind of like how, sounds very similar to what has happened to Black Americans. You just erased and made sure you hid and covered up origin and just said, let's just start from right here at 1619 when we brought some of your ancestors to the Americas enslaved. Seems like you did the same thing with the gospel. You just divorced it from its African roots, made it your own, and said, this is what it is. And now we finna have some issues, because now we're going to talk about the Catholic limits of Afrocentrism. Whenever Protestants use the term Catholic, they brace a little. Less so now than a few decades ago. So it is prudent to note that Catholic is not necessarily being capitalized here. It refers to that universally shared faith held by all believers of all times and places. The focus on Africa might at first seem to convey a certain indirect offense to ecumenism, to the universal scope of the truth, to the Catholicity of the Church, and to the wholeness of global Christianity. It would be an offense against Catholicity to treat Africa as the one and only source of all Christian consensual teaching of all periods and language. That could end in a narrow Afrocentrism that has had unhappy and pretentious results. Afrocentrism must be rejected as an ideological bias contrary to the Catholicity of the faith. But if important contributions have been missed precisely out of ignorance or bias, then they are due some proportional correction. So, if the distinctly African fruits of Christian teaching have been missed, have been taken out, then they must be replanted and cultivated anew the original seed, the early African Christian writers born and immersed in their own African culture. Admittedly, this line of argument can easily deteriorate into exuberant Afrocentrism as if the assertion is being made that all Christian truth essentially emerges out of Africa and is reflected thereafter from African roots. The careful presentation of evidence needs to protect the argument against those temptations and exaggerations. That can be done by constantly recalling what the achievements of African exegesis are interpretations of apostolic teaching, that their early presence in Africa does not point to their moral purity, and that all depends on grace, just what we have learned from the great African theologians. The aim of Catholicity in Christian teaching is to reflect the wholeness of apostolic truth to the whole world. So, pause here because I find it very ironic that now that God is restoring apostles and restoring black apostles to the faith, that many times people have a problem receiving black apostles and black prophets because they don't even understand that the first apostles and prophets were black and African. Things that make you go, The criterion is the accurate attestation of the truth, not the egalitarian goal of making all voices equal. Inclusiveness is essential to Catholicity if what is meant by it is the proclamation of Christian truth in languages accessible to all cultures. Inclusiveness is imprudent to the extent that it embraces false claims or blesses foolishness. The commitment to use early African sources does not misplace or deny the full use of other sources. It is not unusual in classic Christian thinking to utilize texts from one nation or culture without any loss of this universal truth. It is not necessary to cover the whole as long as the part selected reasonably reflects the whole. The common confession of Christians worldwide of all times and places. Classical African Christianity represented ecumenical Christianity better than it was represented anywhere else in the 4th century, and the proof of that is historical. Its judgments were rightly received by ecumenical consent and still are. That remains telling historical evidence. So, if the foundational truths and basis for what became Christian thought that spread throughout the world, if it came originally from African apostles, then why aren't seminaries teaching that? I'll tell you why not, because it's not convenient. It's not convenient to teach that, because that would mean that you cannot push white superiority doctrine through Christian faith. If I have to teach you that the fathers of your faith were African, then I can't push a superior thought process or superior knowledge on you if I don't start your Christianity with Western understanding of Christianity. That's why I'm not going to teach you about the African fathers, because then you'll be looking at the African fathers as the original and primary source of thought, and you won't be looking to the Western theological fathers for that. They won't be hailed as the greatest. Many African Christians today have a deep conviction that they must think in terms that are indigenously African because this is what has been most neglected. That is a valid concern. Christianity meets the criterion of indigenous or traditional African religion since it has 20 centuries of sustained presence in Africa. But length of tenure is not at the heart of what motivates the recovery of African Christian orthodoxy. In fact, orthodoxy knows that it is a false teaching to become fixated on a part of the wholeness of faith so as to ignore the whole history of revelation. This is precisely the definition of heresy. In the brilliance of the Cappadocian teachers, they had only been cursorily investigated or had their great influence not yet been recognized, they too would need the kind of massive restudy of evidence that is now called for in Africa. But Cappadocian teaching has indeed been well studied. So now it is Africa's turn. The hunger to reunite the ancient and the modern vision of Christianity is now growing in Africa. This comes from the heart of Orthodoxy itself, which yearns for the current reappropriation of ancient apostolic truth. The recovery of African Christianity seeks both its own unique identity and to be at the same time a full participant in the whole world of Christianity. The new yearning to recover ancient African texts seeks to correct a prevailing imbalance that has contributed to the African Christian crisis of identity. It seeks now to provide the sources and arguments through which Africans can affirm their distinct Africanness without denying their historic participation in the ecumenical whole. Why is this important? It's important because what we see in Africa right now is we see a Europeanized Christianity being presented to Africa, especially West Africa. And I'm looking at them like, this is your faith. This is the faith of the continent. But if you don't realize that it is the faith of the continent, as he is saying here, that Christianity in Africa has been there for 20 centuries, sustained nonstop. Western Christianity, however, has not been around that long. So what is being presented to West Africans is, again, a Europeanized version of Christianity. And that Europeanized version paints one particular group of people as all-knowing and to be held in awe and marveled at. And you can see this in the way that Western Christianity is presented out of Africa. If I go to an town and I see Kenny Loggins on a billboard with Jesus Saves, that is a problem. It's a problem. And the larger problem is, why hasn't anybody corrected it? I just want to know. If you're a Black American and you have been to Africa and you have seen these billboards with Kenny Loggins on them, I want to ask you, why haven't you told the people that that is not Christ? I just want to know. Or will it start a riot if people realize that that image that they have posted all over their country is not the Christ? Because clearly somebody hasn't told them yet that it is not Christ, because they still posting it. I'm just wondering. I'm looking at all of these Black American preachers who are going over to Africa preaching the gospel, and you get over there and you're not telling these people that this is not Christ that they have on billboards all around their country. I'm just saying. So are we further helping not correct the doctrine? Are we furthering that if we go over there with the Europeanized version of Christianity and we're not pointing them back to their own African roots of Christianity? It seeks to now provide the sources and arguments through which Africans can affirm their distinct Africanness without denying their historic participation in the ecumenical whole. If Africans were saying that they want their sources to come from Africa alone and not anywhere else, then that would be deficient in that it would not represent and reflect the universality of the faith. But this is not the direction of African expectations. They expect and they seek a fair hearing for valid arguments based on evidence. So, this has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I've been your host, Shantae Charles. Next week, we will continue this talk about the need for a universal faith that reflects all parts of the faith with none of its history left out. With none of its history left out. It is time for the westernized faith to recognize the ways in which it has done a disservice to the universal body of Christ by neglecting these parts. All right? So, I hate to bust the bubbles of lots of people, but Europe did not found Christianity. All right? It didn't. Christianity is an African faith. Now, if you're a white supremacist, that might be problematic for you. If you're a white nationalist and you think white is right, that might be problematic for you. If you're reading Paul and you think that Paul was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, please go back and read Acts 21 and Acts 22, where the centurion and the captain said to Paul, "I thought you was an Egyptian thug." Egyptians were not blonde-haired and blue-eyed people. All right, so if you've been reading the Apostle Paul, the Apostle Paul was a man of color. All right, so were some of the other apostles. They were men of color. So if you think that white is right and nobody else is right, that might be problematic for you. But it is what it is, and we're not changing it. All right? So, this has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I've been your host today, Shantae Charles. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please make it your business to be light. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Remember, the first 3 people that I receive an email from telling me what has been your favorite episode so far for season 4 will receive a care package from me. All right. reachshantae@gmail.com is where you can drop that message off. Take care and God bless.